Today on Tip Time, I'm going to give you the strategy I've developed over the years to catch the best waves in the lineup. If you enjoy the channel and want to support, please consider subscribing, but let's get into it. Alright guys, so really good question today from Emily Surf. She's been doing some contests and actually doing quite well, which is awesome, but she's finding that positioning and catching the right waves in these contests is quite tricky. And so today what I wanted to do is share the strategy for positioning and catching the best waves, not only in contests, but also just generally speaking for our everyday surfing. Obviously over time this has changed and I've found I've dialed in a really good strategy here, and I found it's been useful, especially in some of the contests I've done, whether it be nationals or some of the WSL stuff, when the waves are trickiest. Obviously if we're at a wave pool it's nice and easy, but when we've got to actually choose our wave, pick the best position in the lineup when the waves are shifting around, it can get quite tricky. So let's get into that now. So the first thing that you need to be doing before you head out, either for a contest or even for a surf, to make sure you're maximising your time in the water and getting the best waves, is going to be watching the lineup before you go out. If you have a really good idea of how the surf is before you're heading out, you can get a really nice look at where the peaks are and where the waves are breaking consistently. To do this best, you might look at the waves for a good 10-15 minutes before you surf if you're really wanting to hone in on what the conditions are doing. If you know the area well and you know the location and the break, if it's your local spot, then you'll likely have a good idea of what the waves are going to be doing and where they're going to be breaking given the swell and the tide as well. If you're new to a local spot, this is a really good thing to ask locals about as well. See where the best peaks are and see what the predominant wave direction is, and then you can go from there. Now that we've gone through a little bit of a run through on the beach, let's talk through some more of this in the office. Okay, so this is where we can get into some really fun stuff to improve your ability to catch waves out in the lineup. It comes into the second part, which is going to be assessing the waves whilst you're actually out in the water. Then we go into your actual approach for catching the waves and how we're looking at things in that way. And lastly, finishing off with probably the most important one, but our strategy or game plan for catching waves. Are we hunting or are we being patient? Okay, so let's kick into our second point. So that's going to be making sure that we're assessing the lineup from the water. We're obviously going to be using what we found on land in terms of where the predominant peak was and which way the waves were breaking. That's going to set up our basis, but this can change once we're out in the lineup. And also things can look a little bit different once we're out there as well. So it's really important to continue on from here, assessing the conditions. What I would say is make sure that you're trusting the game plan that you've set once you've been on the beach. So it's really easy to get caught and lost in just trying to paddle for everything, but it's not necessarily the case. One of the key things I really like to make sure we're honing in on here is using that first set wave as a buffer, or at least as a template for where the waves are breaking. Usually when we're out in the lineup, even if we're at a beach break, the sets will break, and maybe we have 4 or 5 waves to that set, for example, and you can use that first wave to see where the wave is breaking and how it's breaking. Is it breaking left, right? Is it breaking fast? And also, where is that peak? If it's a bigger wave or a smaller wave, obviously where it's exactly going to break is going to change a little bit, but it at least gives you a good guide as to what it might be looking like. But the key here is looking for trends. Don't just paddle every time you see an individual wave. You have to look for the areas, if possible, where there are multiple waves breaking consistently in that area. And at beach breaks, it might be few and far between, but at least you'll be able to find a spot which you can have the best advantage or the best chance of getting on the best wave, rather than paddling back and forth and not really knowing what you're after. Now, as you spend a bit of time in the lineup, you'll be able to assess which waves are looking like they're the best waves and get a little bit of a feel for which ones these are. So as a wave approaches, you can tell that it's likely or not likely to be a wave that you're going to want to pick up. In a competition, this is really, really important, and the people who do best in the heat are likely to be the people who are really good at judging whether the wave is going to offer a lot of opportunity or whether it's going to close out or not offer as much opportunity. Obviously, the waves that have the best open faces and the biggest are likely to provide the best scores, but you can decide that for the day because especially at beach breaks, this can differ from session to session and day to day. And the last little point that comes into assessing the lineup from when you're out in the water is actually noticing when the waves are approaching what they're going to look like. A lot of the time, as we're beginner surfers and as we get more experienced, we get better at identifying what a good wave will be the further away it is from us. So if we see something coming, say, just for example, 50, 100 meters down, out into the ocean, and we see that coming towards us, we should be seeing and trying to identify, okay, is this a wave that's going to be good for us? What this really, really helps us with is positioning. If you think we're always making last minute decisions for waves, we're pretty much stuck within a 2-meter diameter as to where we can actually get to before the wave breaks. If we're looking way beyond as to where a good wave or where a wave is breaking, say it's 50 meters away, how much distance can I cover to get to the optimal point to catch the wave at, otherwise known as where the breaking part of the wave will be, the peak? How much distance can I cover if I'm looking at it from 50 meters away versus if I'm just noticing it 10 meters away? There's a big distance, and this is one of the key differences I see from experienced surfers to beginner surfers. Experienced surfers will be able to identify the wave from a long way away and paddle to the wave and position themselves and then turn around to catch the wave. Beginner and intermediate surfers often have a little bit more trouble with this because it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to identify the wave from a long way away. But if we can get better at identifying the wave earlier on rather than later, this is going to do so much for your surfing to make sure that you can position correctly and to make sure you're not just at the will of the waves, you can actually go search it out. So hopefully that's helping your ability to assess the waves in the lineup. But now we've got to think about our overall demeanor and approach in the lineup as well. This is something that I think is often missed, but it's super, super important. So it's whether we stay busy and active or whether we just let the waves come to us. And this speaks a little bit into what we talked about before, but I did want to go and break it off into its own section because I think it's so important. We think about beginner surfers or when we're just learning to get out into the lineup. If we're starting from the white water, as we do when we're beginners, quite often we just let the waves come to us. There's just a lot of white water coming through and we can just stay in our position, turn around and catch the wave. Unfortunately, when this translates to our surfing down the line, when we start to get out the back and catch the unbroken waves, what often happens is we'll stay sitting in one spot waiting for the waves to come to us. But then it's quite tricky, especially at beach break waves, to make sure that we're in the right position all the time for the waves to come to us. And what we might not also realize is that different things like the sweep or a rip or something like that will also take us out of position. So something I see quite a lot when we're doing some surf coaching is quite often it's very easy to just sit on your board and get swept out of position. Even if you've made that plan at the start to go out at this position, if we sit and we're not careful as to where our position is, we will drift. So we do have to be active. The other reason we need to be active in the lineup is if we look like we're not searching for a wave, then other people in the lineup are going to take advantage of that and paddle around us. This is just the way it tends to be for experienced surfers in the lineup. If they know where they want to be positioned, they see someone who doesn't appear to be either as eager or maybe even know what they're doing quite as much as they do, which shouldn't be the case, but what you will notice is people will paddle around you. If you look like you've got an objective and you're searching for waves and you're constantly either paddling or trying to make sure you're staying in the same position, so not getting swept down the beach, this is going to be key and do lots to make sure you maintain your position, stopping people from paddling inside you and taking your waves, and also making sure that you stay in the right position in the lineup and don't get swept across when you don't want to. So now that we've assessed the lineup from the beach, from the water, we know what waves we're going to be catching and where to go for those waves. And then we've also fixed our approach to have a very active demeanor in the lineup to make sure that we're in control of our position and then also how other people are maneuvering around us. What we do now, and this is the fun part, is we need to build in some strategy. Now this will work for your free surfs as well, but this is something I've found particularly important and crucial for competitive surfing as well. We need to think about the conditions and what is the best strategy for catching the best waves. I break this into two different components. We can either hunt and be on the search for the waves, or we can be patient. Now, different conditions will lend themselves to these different strategies, but let's get into those now. So as beginners in this sort of scenario, quite often what we do, especially as we're moving into the intermediate stage, is we will catch a lot of different waves and not think about the quality of the wave that we're catching. So this is really typical if you've ever been to a surfing contest or a junior surfing contest especially, you'll see them catching lots and lots and lots of waves, focusing on quantity rather than quality. And this is a big difference that you see between your intermediate surfers in contests and in free surfs versus what they would be doing in the more experienced levels of surfing. And this is something that I can hold myself accountable for, and I know that I did a lot of when I was a junior especially, catching lots of waves and not thinking about waiting for the better quality waves. This comes into a couple of different approaches though, because waiting isn't always necessarily the best thing to do. If you've got the conditions where the waves are pretty consistent and they're breaking in a similar spot, or you can identify which waves are going to be the best, that is where the scenario where you do want to be more patient in general if you're going to pick off the best quality waves. So if you're at a point break, I would say 99% of the time you want to be taking a patient approach, identifying and really thinking about using our previous strategies, which are the best waves, and then making sure that we're catching the best waves to give ourselves the best opportunity on the wave to either surf as well as possible or get the best score if we're in a competition. This will come into beach breaks as well if we can tell that there's some consistent waves coming through and we can tell which waves are the best. It's often going to be the sets that are coming through and breaking in the area that we want them to be breaking in. That's going to be our approach. But sometimes this isn't necessarily the best thing to do, and if you've got really kind of crazy conditions at a beach break and it's difficult to tell where waves are going to be breaking and when they're going to come through. I've had this a few times at the Noosa River mouth or the Noosa beach break where we've been competing and there's just lots of closeouts and it's really hard to tell which waves you should be catching. That's when you might have a little bit of a different strategy and just throw as much at the wall as possible to see what sticks. There's been some really good instances in competitions I've watched where people have had a patient strategy and a more active hunting strategy where they're trying to just throw a lot at the wall, as I said, to see maybe they luck into a few good waves. And I have actually seen that latter approach really pay off in certain instances. Again, where there's not a lot of good waves coming through and it's better to just try and cover all bases, catch as many waves as possible because maybe you'll get an inkling of one that will line up. What I do think we need to start looking for here though in this strategy component is we never just sit and don't do anything. If we're sitting out in the lineup and looking for the best wave, our eyes are constantly scanning out to the horizon to see where the waves are coming, and we want to see and judge that wave as early as possible because as we spoke about before, this gives us the best opportunity to paddle where we need to position ourselves correctly rather than waiting for it just to come in front of us and present itself to us, which, as we know, very rarely happens. So if we're going to take that patient approach, we're actively seeking out waves still. So that's an approach that took me a long time to get right, but these are the 4 things that I like to use to make sure that I have the best chance possible to catch the best waves, either in a free surf or a competition. And it's some stuff that, I've spent a fair bit of time trying to dig into and cultivate for my surfing so that I can be as successful as possible. And I hope that it can work for you guys as well. So I hope the rant was okay there. This is one that I'm pretty passionate about and I like to walk through. So thanks again, Emily, for the question. That was a really, really good one. If you do have any further questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'd love to hear either how any of this applies to your surfing. If you try any of it, let me know if it works or if it doesn't, and you have more questions about it, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to have a read and have a bit of a chat about that. I think that's it for today, but I hope you're all getting waves and we'll catch you in the next one.